Welcome to this session on list and replication. So we're going to do a couple of short exercises in this session just to explain the concepts of list and replication. So we'll start by creating a new file, and I'm just going to name this GC underbar list. So once that opens up, I'm going to, of course, start by placing the base CS in the file, place it in the design model, select OK, and I'll switch over to my Transactions tab and record that first transaction. And we can see that base CS here down at our 00 origin. I'm going to go into the View Attributes and just turn off that ACS triad. And then I'm going to just place a single point in the model. So I'm just going to go to my node types and select the point node. If I go over to my graph, I can see that point has been added, and again, it is also at the 00 origin. And for now, we'll just leave it there. Now I'm going to add a second point. So again, I'll just put that on the graph. And this one I'm going to make some modifications to. So first I'm going to change the Y translation, and we'll just put 10 in here so that it moves off our 00 origin up in the Y direction by a distance of 10. And then for the X translation, and I'm going to just open the editor, I'm going to type in a list. So rather than have one X translation, I'm going to have multiple. And so list, always go in curly brackets. Learned that in the previous course, GC 101. And then I'm going to type a list of values. So I'm going to start with 0, and then we'll just do 5, 10, 15, and 20. Close the curly bracket. I'm going to select Apply and Close. And you can now see that point 2, if I select the node on the graph, it highlights the points in the model, and we can see point 2 now is actually a list of 5 different points. Point 1 is still a single point. Point 2 is 5 points. And let's go back to the transactions and record that. So 2 nodes on the graph, but different sets of points. And if I hover my cursor over one of those points in the model, we can see we get a pop-up, and it indicates that's point 1. But let's hover the cursor over point 2, and if you'll notice there is a number there after point 2. It's in square brackets, and that's what we call indexing. So that indicates its position in the list. 0 being the first position, 1 being the second position, 2 being the third, 3 being the fourth position, and 4 being the fifth position. And that gives us a way to call those points. For instance, if I wanted to draw a line from point 1 to maybe the second point in this list, I could select that individual point. So I'm going to go back to my node types, and we'll place a line node on the graph. And I'm simply going to create a line by points. We'll link the start point to point 1 and the end point to point 2. And as you might expect, we end up with 5 lines. So it draws a line from point 1 to each of the points in the list that is point 2. Let's go over to Transactions and just record that transaction. But perhaps you don't want to draw that line to all the points in point 2. You'd like to specify one of those points. And so this is where we use that indexing. So I'm going to go back to the endpoint. Let me go back to the editor, and I'm going to add that square bracket. And for instance, I could put an index of 1. So an index of 1 would indicate the second point in the list. And I apply that, and you can see that now only one line is drawn, and it's drawn to the second point in that list. So you can use indexing to specify particular members of a list. And let me go ahead and record that transaction. But now let's go back and we're going to talk a little bit about replication. So I'm going to remove the indexing that we put on there so that we go back to having the entire list and we get 5 lines. So in this case, we had one input which was not a list, it was a single point, and we had a second input which was a list. And so it's fairly simple that it draws 5 lines there. But what if our start point was also a list? Then you would have 2 lists which need to interact. So let me just record the current state where we're at, and then I'm going to change point 1. So rather than have the X translation at 0, I'm going to make this a list. So again, I'm going to use the curly bracket, and we're going to do 0, and then 5, and then 10, and then we're going to close that. So this list has 3 members at 0, 5, and 10 for the X translation. And we'll apply that. And you can immediately see we now have 3 lines, and they're drawn from the first point in one list to the first point in another list, the second point in one list, the second point in another list, and so forth, until we run out of points in one list, and then it simply stops. So this is a particular replication style. This is called Replication Parallel. And it basically means that there's a one-to-one relationship between the members of each list. The first member of the first list is matched with the first member of the second list, and so on, until one list runs out of members. Let's go ahead and record that. And then I'm going to go back to the line node. So you'll notice there's a little graphic on there, and that indicates, if I hover over that, you can say it says replicated parallel. It indicates the replication style that's applied to that node. But we can switch that. So if I right-click on the node, I can come down and there is a toggle which is switch replication style. So this is going to switch it to a style which is called all combinations. And you can see how that changes the result there. Now we have lines drawn from every point to every point. In other words, it matches each point in one list with every point in the other list. And that's what we call replication all combinations. So let's go ahead and record that. And again, we could use indexing to select particular members from one list and then particular members from another list. But that can get a bit tedious, and sometimes it won't give us a result that can be updated easily. If I change the number of members in this list, if I add some X translations, I may now have more members in this list, and the indexing would no longer be valid. For instance, right now, the last point in this list has an index of 4. If I added 3 more points, the point that is indexed at 4 would no longer be the last point. And perhaps it's the last point that I'm always interested in connecting the line to. So there are some basic list functions that allow us to call members of a list not by their indexing, but by their position in the list, for instance, first or last or middle, or we could even use things like rest. So you could say, starting from index 2 and then the rest of the points. So there is a list of some of those list functions in the workbook, and let's just take a look at how we might use those. So I'm going to modify my points here. So instead of just point 1, I'm going to type in the dot operator. That pulls up a function menu. And I'm going to just start typing this in, but you could also scroll through the list. You can see it gives us a hint explaining what this function does. Without a specified count, it returns the first member of this list. If a count is specified, it returns a new list comprising that many members of the beginning of this list. So for instance, you could put a first with a count of 2, and then it would be the first 2 members of that list. So we're going to put in first, and then we're just going to put in some empty parentheses. The parentheses are where you would put in that argument, that count. So if I wanted the first 2 members, I would put 2 in there. If I simply want the first member, I can leave it blank. And we're going to select Apply. And notice how that changed our lines here. Now we're only drawing from that first member, or that first point in that list. And then let's look at the end point, and we're going to change this one again. I can type in that dot operator, and this time I'm going to use last. And this time we will put the function in, and I'll say 2. So this is saying the last 2 points in that list, and we're going to apply those. And you can see here now we've got just 2 lines drawn to the last 2 points in that list. And then let's go ahead and record that transaction. And I'm going to go back to point 2, and I'm actually going to change the inputs here. So let's take a look at that X translation. So what if we reduced some of the members of this list? In other words, let's take off 20 there, so we only have 4 points. And we'll apply that. So it actually moved those lines, so now again they're still using the last 2 points in the list. If I had tried to use indexing to specify those points, the indexing would no longer be correct. So that's how you can use some of those list functions to specify particular members in a list. I'm going to go ahead and record that transaction. And that's just a brief overview of some of the things you can do with list and replication and some basic list functions. And we will be using those as we create a stacking model.